Sid, you've said that Walter Henley was a mentor.
Hanley.
Walter Hanley. Um, when did you start working with Jennings Lang?
Well, that's the point that I was kind of working my way through. Uh, as far as the date is concerned, I couldn't give you the date if my life depended on it. But there did come a day when Mr. Wasserman asked me whether or not I would like to work with Jennings Lang. And Jennings was a real character. He had been with the agency, and his job, and he really reported to no one. I mean, he reported to the angels. By no one, I mean excluding Lou Wasserman. He was just like kind of like a wild, crazy man. The idea was that Jennings was very unhappy with the service that he was getting from the studio business affairs and law department, believed in using neither. And my job was going to be to walk 2 steps behind him, make his deals, get some papers signed, and see that orderly things were done. And there was kind of an implication said obscurely, and also watch and see that he doesn't do anything too insane. He always traveled with bottle. And I'll tell you a typical Jennings Lang story, what he meant by service. One day, a pilot was made starring Ernest Borgnine called McHale's Navy. It was to be an action-adventure hour show. The show turned out very disappointingly and was edited down to a half-hour comedy. I'm in my office one day, and it's about 12:30, and I get a call from Jennings, and Jennings says to me, "Can you get a short-form contract here while we're having lunch? Because I want to try to get Ernie to sign it before he leaves for lunch." Now, you know, in the ordinary course of business, this would be somebody would work on this for a week or certainly a day. So I spend about a half hour from memory. I don't even have any forms, you know, and I typed this contract out, and he calls me up in, you know, in about a half hour, and he says, "Where are you?" You know, I said, "Well, I'm just finishing it up." It was about 2 or 3 pages long. He says, "Well, come on down. Ernie's waiting. We're waiting for you." So I go down to the commissary with this 2.5-page document, and he signs it. And we never had a formal agreement with Ernie Borgnine, and we lived with that contract, which I did and absolutely did not take me an hour. And that's what Jennings called service. In other words, Jennings wanted a deal done in 5 minutes, the contract signed in 10, and, you know, let's start in 15.
And Lou wanted it to hold, to stick.
Well, Lou realized the relationship between Lou and Jennings was a very interesting one. I think that Lou had a great fondness for Jennings, but realized himself that Jennings was Jennings. In other words, you couldn't put Jennings in a cage. He was an animal that had to roam, and that was his strength. And he got into trouble once when he shot the testicle off of or somebody shot one of his testicles off because he was involved with the wife of a famous director, Jennings. but he taught me a great deal, and he was one of the greatest showmen I've ever met in my life. The trick was to distinguish between ideas that were brilliant and ideas that were terrible, because he was, at any given moment, he was capable of both. And the distinction between them was not necessarily obvious.
But just name one thing you learned from Jennings that you incorporated in your own.
These questions about say one thing are all very deceptive, because things don't stand on their own. I think one thing I learned from Jennings is to be brave. I alluded earlier to having rebelled against my parents' fears. Jennings was really brave when it came to dealing with people. And he convinced me that I could do things I didn't think I could do. He's the one, I mean, I'd never made deals before. I was a lawyer. You know, lawyers negotiated force majeure clauses and what happens when there's a strike, and, you know, and things of that sort. Not basic money points. Well, he convinced me I could do it, and then he later convinced me that I could be as creative as anybody else. And I would say he was the most significant person in my evolution from a legal business type to a creative production genius, which of course I became.
And how long did your association continue?
The association continued through a period of time when I was the boss, basically, and Jennings was working for me. And he got a stroke, and it's just a terrible thing. He was one of those people that I really miss. He was one of the people that really gave character. You know, Lou was capable of taking great chances on things that he believed in, but nonetheless perpetuated I don't want to say it's a myth, but it was not exactly the case, that he was very straight and square. And you know, we used to share an apartment in New York, and this makes the point as well as any. I once opened, one of the first times I was there, I opened up this closet, and I saw in this closet what had to be 20 suits. Every single suit was exactly the same. I opened up the drawer where there were shirts. There were 4 drawers of shirts, white shirts, every one exactly the same.
And these were Lou Wasserman's, not Jennings Lang's.
These were Lou Wasserman's. Jennings Lang would wear colorful, theatrical, you know, no one would confuse the two. But Jennings, you know, we were in the entertainment business. And even though people respected us as good businessmen, and Lou was certainly as highly regarded as anyone probably in the history of the entertainment business, there were those people that felt we lacked showmanship. And Jennings certainly brought some of that.
Mm. Well,
and I was stuck between them.
Hopefully getting the best of both. How long was the review name used? And was there a discernible difference when it became Universal Television?
I don't remember when we switched to Universal. Remember that the history of the acquisition, Lou bought the lot before he bought the company. By the lot, I mean the Universal Studios lot. Then the company was purchased, and it was after that, what year that was, I don't remember, that
1962.
1962 the lot was purchased?
Well, they purchased the lot first in 58, and then MCA bought Universal Pictures in 62.
Well, I remember the 58 because I never worked at Republic or that studio where they were tenants.
Yeah.
So I came along with about the same time as the lot, so I can identify with the 58. And then the picture company was purchased in 62.
Correct. And in fact, I was going to ask if you were involved in any of the decisions or the legal work required with that deal, or
No,
okay.
I wasn't, but I did opine on some important subjects. Once we acquired the Universal Library and Company, the question arose as to the rights in a lot of the properties, not so much for motion pictures as for television. And this was an area that Arnold Nemeroff, whom I mentioned earlier, he was kind of, during his lifetime, the go-to guy on Paramount properties and more than Universal properties. But questions would arise. I'll give you a hypothetical. I remember this one because I always dreaded the fact that I was wrong. And I don't think I was, but the history of the contracts in Hollywood is a subject about which a book could be written. And it might even be an amusing book, because there were stories told about how these contracts got to be what they were, the way they were. And for example, there were things in these contracts that nobody knew what they meant. You know, the word violets or purples or something appeared in some of these contracts, and no one knew what one was. So when the other side would ask you to take the word out that nobody knew what it was, you were put in the position of saying, well, we're not going to take it out. And they say, well, if you can't tell me what it is, how can you expect me to agree to it? In any event, it was believed that the Paramount had been the first company to use what evolved as certain forms of agreement. And many of the agreements for the acquisition of rights used the words motion pictures, and then later in some other place used the words in whatever medium, you know, recorded, or, and then someplace else it would use the words projected, exhibited, or
Displayed. Or
you know, and then the very simple question would come up, namely, do we have television rights? The word television didn't appear. Now, was a television episode a motion picture? Was the exhibition of the television episode a form of exhibition covered by an omnibus type of exhibition clause? You can see how that's question people could come to different answers, and particularly lawyers who by nature can, you know, the best lawyer example was used by a former president of the United States when he said those famous words, "Depends what you mean by is." And I opined on that subject that we did own under the basic Paramount contracts, and Universal's were similar, that the words motion picture, however exhibited, included motion pictures made for television.
Well, then I will return to that subject. But who, when
I
you
might
look at-
change my mind now.
what were some of the key series that Universal was developing in the mid-'60s, and who hit upon the idea of developing The Virginian as a 90-minute show?
Well, as far as whose idea it wasn't mine. My guess would have to be it was Jennings or Lou's, but I could not testify whose it was. Both these gentlemen had a rather thorough command of the properties. You know, we made Going My Way as a series. The circumstances under which it was developed are interesting in the sense that the National Broadcasting Company had been broadcasting Wagon Train, and Wagon Train was a big hit. And Wagon Train was also important to RCA, which was the parent of it, because RCA was also in the business of selling color television sets, and television was turning to color. So the idea of a show with they called them blue sky shows. The idea of a blue sky show that had good stories and leads that worked, and the original leads for Wagon Train, I think it was Ward Bond was the senior guy, and I want to say Doug McClure. I could be wrong, but in any event, what happened was that Universal, and I was not involved in this, but Lou Wasserman was, managed to take that show and sell it from NBC to ABC, which didn't on its face make NBC too happy. And his answer was, well, don't worry about that. We've got something better for you. And what we've got for you is this show called The Virginian. By the way, I don't even think it had been cast. I'll give you a nickel if you remember who played The Virginian. And if you wrote it down this morning, it doesn't count. Jim Drury. And the more I think about it, the more I think Doug McClure was in The Virginian, not in Wagon Train. But whose idea it was to pull what was a sort of bait and switch, I can't tell you.
Well, now, who produced Wagon Train? It wasn't a Universal show.
Of course it was.
It was. Okay,
Both of them
okay.
were Universal shows.
So was Wagon Train your first show in color?
I don't know. I think so.
Okay.
I think Wagon Train was produced by a man called Red, and his first name was Howard Christie. Anybody who watches this and finds that there are errors in this should be quiet.
Okay. Well, now, in 1966, NBC starts buying these 2-hour movies from you. The premiere
They buy one first. And the one was a remake of a movie written by I can't remember who wrote it. It's called The Killers, and it stars in his first role as a heavy in his career none other than a guy that needed a job by the name of Ronald Reagan. And Angie Dickinson was in it. And at that time, there were some people in the Congress who were making some noise about violence on television. This happens periodically. When we delivered this program to NBC, they said, it's very good, it's what we ordered, and keep the money, but we're not going to play it because we'll get so much heat because of its violence, which, by the way, is nonsense. I mean, they may have gotten heat because of its violence, but it didn't really have any violence. I mean, not by yesterday's or today's standards. But later, then they bought 3 more, as I recollect. And then they placed a very big order, which you probably have the year of, but I don't.
I thought it was 1966, and this was the world premiere series. And I didn't know if it was...
Well, it wasn't a series. It was the world premiere concept. There were arguments, by the way, about who created the words world premiere.
Were you part of those arguments?
One could argue that the words world premiere were created by Barnum and Bailey or something, but there was that disagreement.
Did you always intend to use these TV movies as pilots?
Yes.
Okay.
We, by you mean me,
Universal.
Jennings, Lou, yes. And I think NBC. And we used them very effectively to everybody's advantage.
Well, by 1968, you're named Vice President of Universal Television. Who did you succeed and who did you report to?
I don't think I succeeded anybody, or if you've got a hint, let me know. And who I reported to didn't change either. I think it was just a recognition that my authority was increasing. The titular president of Universal Television, who had nothing to do with Universal Television, was Taft Schreiber, who happened to be a neighbor of mine, and he was the House Republican, he and Jules Stein.
In 1968, you also signed Steven Spielberg. How did he come to your attention, and what made you sign him so swiftly to a 7-year deal?
I'll answer that question, but briefly, because I've answered that question so many times that anybody who doesn't know the answer to that question doesn't deserve to know. One day, I was running a picture in a projection room at Universal, and a guy who was the librarian, studios had libraries, stock libraries at that time, said to me that a buddy of his had made this short. Would I look at it? I said, sure, put it in the projection room. And there were days I didn't have a projection room yet. And there were days I could con my wife into, having dinner and watching something. The thing that I watched was a program called Subterfuge, starring Gene Barry. And the reason I watched it was that somebody had invented a process where you could see what you're shooting while you were shooting it and after you were shooting it. Now, this day and age of videotape, that sounds like a silly statement. The answer is, of course you could see it, just play it. But in film, that was a big deal. It was kind of a photo assist process, and there were all kind of esoteric arguments about whether or not it was a good or bad idea. There are those who thought it was a bad idea because they thought that what people would do is they would want to look at everything they shot and want to reshoot it just because they saw that there was a fly on something. And anyhow, I saw it, and then I saw this thing called Amblin. And I asked Chuck Silver, who was the name of the librarian, to arrange for the guy who had made this to see me the next day, that I thought it was very well done. I'd like to talk to him about coming aboard. This very scrawny, I mean with a capital S, guy with the big glasses comes into my office the next day and introduces himself, and I tell him how much I like the product that he showed me and how we'd like to make a deal with him. And he said, I have only one request. He said, and that is that I am allowed to direct a film before I'm 21 years old. And I told him, as I've been quoted 1,000 times, I said, I will try, but I can't promise you that because I can't go around ordering people to use directors. I mean, I may have the authority to do so, but I'm not going to do so, and that would be bad. So I signed this contract with him. It is a 7-year contract. He's guaranteed $300 a week. And he comes to work. And I took the responsibility quite seriously. And we were making a show at the time called
Night Gallery?
Night Gallery, which was Twilight Zone-ish, even to the degree of having Rod Serling as a host. This particular segment was produced by Bill Sackheim, who passed away some years ago. And I convinced Bill to use Stephen because he used to take pride in starting young directors, as I do. And all of a sudden, it's like the world is going to end. The word gets around that it's terrible. And Bill Sackheim had and I'm not saying this, certainly don't want to speak ill of the dead, and I certainly don't want to say this was an intentional thing, but one of the problems with Bill Sackheim is that he tended to view things as being in crisis so he could save the crisis. I don't know what Epstein-Barr is, but there's a women's illness, as I understand it, which is probably not Epstein-Barr, but women whose children must be perceived of as being ill so they can be saved. Well, he was kind of the film equivalent of that. The film had to be in trouble so he could really work on it and save it. Well, needless to say, it didn't make my job any easier. It satisfied the requirement about it, but it didn't make my job any easier. And there's two elements that go with that. One, Lou Wasserman, there's one story that Lou Wasserman got a call complaining about Stephen from Joan Crawford, I don't believe there's a scintilla of truth to it. And another story that I know is true, which is that I got a call or a note saying, could I stop by and see her next time I was in New York? And I did stop by her apartment. I was afraid to go in there, to be deadly honest with you. And she was very much involved at that time with the Pepsi-Cola company, you may remember. And she said to me, she says, I just want to tell you how incredible this young director is, and you really have an incredible find there. And I said, really? And she said, absolutely. I mean, this young man, is wonderful. Coming from Joan Crawford, that's better than chopped liver.
And is it true that Betty Davis had actually turned down the role?
No, I don't know that.
Okay. Good to rule that out then.
I didn't say it wasn't true. I just don't know it.
Yeah. Were you questioned by colleagues or by Mr. Wasserman for championing Spielberg in those early years?
Was I what?
Questioned or doubted?
No. He knew Stephen. I made it my business to introduce Stephen to Lou, and he was fond of him. There are certain books that allude to certain things that Lou supposedly was involved in that he wasn't, but he was certainly fond of him, and Stephen was certainly fond of Lou.
Yeah. Well, in 1971, you were named president of Universal Television. Who did you succeed in that job?
Well, really nobody. I mean, on paper, I succeeded Taft Schreiber, but
Taft had not really been doing the operating job.
Taft had, during my entire career, I don't know what Taft did other than collect art and represent the company in its interest with key Republicans. I'm not demeaning that job, by the way. That was very important. But Taft, this has got nothing to do with this interview whatsoever, but I believe that Taft Schreiber was probably very responsible during the Six-Day War, if you remember when that was, and I don't remember when that was, but getting the United States, I guess that was during the Nixon period, to get Iran to allow planes to land there on their way to Israel, and may have been responsible for saving Israel.
Mm. That's a contribution then.
Now, if all that dating is wrong, cut this.
When you took over as president of Universal Television, to whom
I
did
clearly reported to Lou.
Okay, thank you. And did you have immediate concerns or goals?
Well, Lou and I didn't have the same exact philosophy of management. They may sound the same, but they really weren't the same. I believed very much. There are people that will disagree with you and say that I'm giving myself credit that I don't deserve. But I believe very much that people who were in charge of divisions should be responsible for running those divisions, even if there was a certain inefficiency in their so doing. Lou was much more a believer in what I think today would be considered a flat management style. I mean, it's easy if you're in charge of everything. We had goals. I mean, we always wanted to be a network because we always were afraid of the power of the networks. A lot of stories can be told about that. There's a certain irony that all these years later, NBC ends up buying Universal, when one of the deals that nearly happened with us was a deal to merge NBC with Universal. Here it is all these years later. It happens. So what do? They sell it to Comcast.
But that's getting it a little further ahead. You were in the period of financial interest and syndication rules.
Yes. That's an intimately connected subject.
Yes. And in some respects, it was regarded as the heyday and the golden era for producers who could keep much of the profit from the back end.
I believe, as a matter of principle, and to me it's nearly a religious belief, that the networks should not be permitted to have a control of programming beyond a certain point.
And you still feel that way?
I still feel that way, even though there's now 4,000 networks. Every day I flip my digital dial, I discover 3 or 4 new networks that I never knew existed, but they're really kind of irrelevant.
What's your objection? Is it to the quality of the programming, or to certain rights being circumscribed?
It's my views of the antitrust laws. See, I could do a whole interview like this just on the antitrust laws. They really interest me because I was brought up to believe that the enforcement of the antitrust laws are necessary for us to ultimately maintain our democracy. That a country which doesn't have an ability for people to enter markets and has monopolization and oligopolization as the order of the day will ultimately cease being a democracy. Those were the thoughts of Milton Handler. And I think they're right. And when the so-called Chicago School began to take over the economic thinking in the United States, I don't remember what year that was, but it happened rather quickly, and it was all part of the internationalization of, Americans were told that in order for you to compete in the world, you can't have your antitrust laws, In order to violate when's the last time somebody violated the antitrust laws? I mean, you have to have somebody fixing prices, and it would have to be photographed, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Well, these definitions of markets and these whole issues of barriers
very
of entry
complicated.
Became part and parcel to your job once you agreed to become president of MCA. I mean, from 73 on, a lot of these issues, you were defining new markets.
We were defining markets. The problem was that we all knew in our heart that we would ultimately lose this war.
With the network?
With the networks, because the fact that we were able to maintain the financial interest and syndication rules as long as we were able to do so was not only a testament to the political wisdom of the people who were in charge, but it was also a testament to the Lew Wassermans and the Taft Schreibers of this world. I mean...
and you were not involved in the lobbying or the...
Oh, I was involved in lobbying.
No, with the adoption of the rules.
I would say I was involved.
You were.
I was involved because the adoption of the rules by the FCC were often accompanied by some phone calls from people in the Senate saying, we think that this is the way it ought to be, and if you really think otherwise, we better have some hearings on this subject.
And that was late 60s, right?
If you say so. But the rules were being eroded. They were constantly being challenged. As I say, I have no motive today. I own no shares that I know of in any network, and I'm certainly not an active supplier of television programs. But I think it's a mistake. Here's the thing that is the most significant. I believe it's not in the network's best interest. I think the fact that you yourself limit your suppliers, the financial benefit that it derives is not worth the loss of an independent opposition. It's like an independent opposition.
Well, I'm going to take you to your promotion of president and chief operating officer of MCA. You were somewhat torn about leaving more of the creative responsibilities behind, or delegating those, and moving into that corporate office or that corporate role. What finally persuaded you?
Well, I didn't really have a choice. Lou Wasserman, I remember this as if it were yesterday. We were having lunch, and he turned to me and he said, "You are going to hire somebody to be president of Universal Television." And he says, "You want Frank Price?" Because he was kind of the number 2 person. He says, "Name Frank Price." He said, "But whether you like it or not, you're going to be made president of this company at our next board meeting." I was ordered to be president, and I didn't have the nerve, because I was dealing with a man who was getting older, knew that he was getting older, and you're absolutely right. People don't believe this. I really had a lot of first of all, to be a president following Lou Wasserman, that ain't easy to do. Nobody believes you're really the president. Some people to the degree of saying, "We're not going to pay any attention to you." Mike Maitland, who was head of the record company, said, "I came here to report to Lou Wasserman." And, I had to earn it. Lou couldn't simply say, "You're president." I mean, he could say it, but you had to earn being president.
Well,
and I think I did.
Well, within a matter of years, you and Lou took on Betamax.
Me, not Lou. Lou supported me, but I take the responsibility for it.
And are you the person who turned to Disney and enlisted them as a
Yes.
co-plaintiff?
They only paid $50,000 to support it. You know how much lawyers' time $50,000 gets you?
Even in the 70s?
Even in the 70s.
And I believe that case was filed in 1976. So that was just 3 years into your presidency.
Yeah, I thought the Sony Betamax case was the most ridiculous case imaginable. I couldn't imagine losing the case.
So you got the
It's
first...
wrong. It's decided wrongly.
was decided in 79, and then it was reversed in 81, and then it finally wound up at the Supreme Court with a decision in 84. So you carried that for 8 years.
I can't tell you how disappointed I was when we lost.
You and Lou sometimes were criticized for your rigid business practices. You were sticklers that didn't always suit every agent in town or every lawyer. But you weren't particularly old-fashioned about technology. You embraced disco vision. You embraced discs that could not record. That was one of your other practical answers, I think, to videotape.
We knew that they could record ultimately.
But in the short term,
yes,
you saw a market.
We saw that as an option to develop a market for our product in addition to television, which we saw as subject to excluding us.
And as a business partner, you did business with IBM.
Yes, I must say that was one of the more disappointing periods of my professional life. I found that there was less there than met the eye.
But you finally made some money on the patents, right?
I made that deal also. Who would have believed that IBM needed earnings in a quarter? I mean, here we have this little teeny Hollywood company. I don't even remember what we were earning in those days, and versus IBM that would be a footnote. MCA would be a footnote to their miscellaneous income. And they put us in a position one day where they wanted to sell their interest, and under the contract we had with them, we had the right to buy their interest at the price they weren't prepared to sell it, or to sell along with them. And buying their interest we didn't think was the smartest thing to do. So we sold along with them, and we sold it to people who really knew what they were doing, even though they'd never done it.
Pioneer?
Yeah, it's an incredible story. I mean, we had like a 16% yield. The whole game was a game of yield. And over one weekend, they increased the yield from 16% to like 86%. Tom Wertheimer will remember the exact numbers, but
This was all about the quality control in a clean environment and producing clean discs.
That's simple. You know, they hired mostly Oriental or people, what's the politically proper way to put that? They didn't hire ethnically Mexican, Guatemalan, Colombian, or Latinos. That probably violates the law, but
I thought they might have just found a different clean room to use.
well, they did that too. You know, but it was amazing. This was over a weekend. Friday, yield 16%. Monday, yield 86%. You know what that does to the price? We still were too late to capture the market.
Well, others were in it too. I mean, Polygram had a different system, Philips. I mean, other people were looking at this.
Nobody had the system we had. The Philips system and our system were basically similar, but RCA had a system called the capacitance system, which was embarrassingly old-fashioned. There's an interesting story behind that also, and I'm reminded of it right now because I'm having lunch with the man in a day or two. You may remember that EMI had a system, and Gary Dartnell, who's a really nice man, comes to see me and says, we want to license your product. And I basically said in the legally correct way, why should we license our product to you? We got enough problems making our own system work. And your system doesn't work either. He said, well, there must be a price at which you would do it. I said, look, I had in my mind, don't ask me why, but we had made a series that was the most financially expensive series. I don't know if anybody's made one since. it was 16 two-hour films. Now, what the hell was it called? It was basically a history of the world. I can't think of the name of it. Anyhow, we had a gigantic deficit in this series. And I turned to him and I said, we'll make a deal with you if you'll license those and guarantee us an amount of money equal to $100 million. Now, the normal response to someone who has a system that doesn't work should be, you got to be crazy. He said something to the effect of, I think I can make that work. So he goes off, we make this deal, and the money is payable on the last day on which this acquisition of rights is exercisable or something like that. And I get a call from Gary, who said he wanted to come in and see me. So I went and talked to probably Tom, and I said, you know something? I know exactly what's going to happen. He's going to come in, he's going to say, it's immoral. You can't ask us to pay you $100 million for a system that we can't get off the ground, and yes, we should pay you something, but it shouldn't be anything like $100 million. I said, that's what's going to happen. I said, that's what would happen if I were on the other side, which I never would have done. Gary comes into my office, and he sits down, and he takes out an envelope, and he hands it to me. Doesn't say anything. I open up the envelope, and there's a check from EMI for $100 million.
That's got to go down as one of the amazing deals.
He's a terrific. He said, this is what we owe you. You delivered what you said you'd deliver. Namely, we had the rights, and we couldn't make it work, and that's just the way it is.
And they still paid. Wow. Sid,
I would have taken 50 also.
about this time, Warner had gotten into cable television ownership.
Right.
You must have looked at it.
We looked at it. Lou, it was very hard to sell Lou cable. And I must say, I didn't disagree with him. It always seemed to me to be talking about, I always thought of Western Union. Here we're going to connect these wires. The world is going to be a world of wireless communication.
But you never went into any of the DirecTV satellite television consortiums.
No.
What held you back there?
I don't know. I think maybe we were just too oriented to being basically program producers.
But all of this, as you explained to me many times, was really driven by
Not everything we did was right, by the way. The answer may simply be we were wrong.
You, by the early 80s, you were already describing television and film, motion picture production. You were describing television particularly as a mature business, and that many of these actions were, you didn't use the word protective, but you were looking out for ways to enhance, expand that business and protect it, if you will, from new entrants. And you argued that it wasn't hard for new players to come into the television business. I think by 1984, when you were talking about this, you had home box office very much on your mind, because they had, as early as 1980, accounted for 69% of all pay TV subscriptions. And
well, home box office, as I have said in many interviews, were the single most impossible people to deal with I ever dealt with in my life. And each time I see Michael Fuchs, I think of some of these incredible meetings. I mean, they actually plotted negotiations like people plot the invasion of Normandy.
Well, let's go back. In '76, you filed the lawsuit against Betamax. By the late '70s, you were looking at video disc technology and investing some in that, and certainly time and energy. Did you feel that you let HBO get a running start? They put their programming up on a satellite in '75, and by 1979, you were talking to Showtime and you were talking to Paramount, and four of the studios ultimately formed Premiere in 1980. And by then, HBO had that 69% of the market.
Had Premiere been permitted to exist, that 16% of the market could have melted quickly. And unfortunately, we didn't handle that as correctly as we might have.
Well,
Tom
to recap,
Wertheimer's famous words to the judge, "Do I get a get out of jail free card?" was not considered by the judge to be very funny.
well, to recap, it was four of the six major film companies.
Fox, Paramount, us, and who else? Disney?
Fox, Paramount, Universal, and 20th Century Fox. Oh, no, we said that Fox. I want to say United Artists. It was not Warner, and it was not Disney. And Getty Oil as the financial backer.
No. Really? Well, if you've got it
the
written,
opinion.
I'll accept
I've got
it.
the opinion.
Getty,
They had purchased controlling interest of ESPN. They were your financial backer.
what are you flipping through?
The Supreme Court decision.
Oh, the Supreme
No,
Court.
no, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I do have the preliminary injunction that came down on New Year's Eve, 1980.
I don't think it ever got beyond the preliminary injunction.
It didn't. But then you guys regrouped and tried to go back by merging Showtime and Movie Channel. You tried any number of combinations in the early 80s to break into that pay TV distribution business.
And
apart from USA Network, you never really did take a stake, did you?
no, we really never had an opportunity to. I had a number of conversations with the then ownership of Showtime, trying to convince them that what they should do is, and I thought it was a great idea, they should basically make an agency arrangement with 2 or 3 of the studios, and that the studios would be the principals, and that would give them a real shot at a big piece of the market, that you couldn't get a big piece of the market otherwise. We ultimately, and Disney, put Stars in business. I don't know if they're still in business, but we put them in business, and they were quite successful. But one studio itself, didn't work.